to meet all of you. Hopefully we have a chance to have a bit of a conversation today, with some questions or just some conversation. Excited to be here. First of all, just thanks to Clue, Carlton, Audrey, Jin, everyone on the team for making this happen. It's fun to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to you about, one thing basically, which is, what UX research looks like in industry, like when you actually get the job and what it is. But I'm going to split this into kind of two parts. So one is there's some stuff that I think is really important that you understand about the practice today. And then the second half, I will pause for questions then. And then the second half is all about where I think this is going to go over the next 10 years. And the reason I think this is important is one is to help you be successful when you get your first gig. And there's a couple of really important lessons to understand in order to do that, that's outside of the traditional methods that you're going to learn and the analysis and all that kind of stuff that you'll probably cover in school. And the second bit is I think it's important to know where the discipline is going so that you can best prepare yourself for the changes that are coming and take advantage of them for your own career. So that's kind of what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the present, and we're going to also try and look ahead. So naturally, let's start with the present. So before we do, let's first hopefully discuss why you should even listen to me and whether or not I have any credibility about this. So I've been a researcher for almost a decade. I'm one of the co-founders of UXR Collective and UXRConf. But the important thing is that I talk to researchers a lot. And right now we're going through submissions for UXRConf applications, and I'm had about 30 just this week with researchers around the world at various levels of seniorities for some really interesting companies and all that kind of stuff. And this is like a big thing that's a passion of mine, of understanding what's going on and understanding how we can move the field forward. So I've over the time through hundreds and thousands of conversations, I've developed a bit of a perspective about where we're at and where we're going. So hopefully that makes you think of me as a credible source on this, and hopefully lend some credence to what we're going to talk about. So let's start with the present. Let's talk about research today. And what this is all going to be about is a couple of concepts that you probably aren't going to be taught in school, but are pretty fundamental to your success as a researcher once you get into industry, once you get that job. And we're going to talk about why these things are important to understand, and hopefully help you understand what you can do about these two concepts. So the first thing that is just critical to understand is that researchers create value indirectly by helping others make better decisions. This is important to understand because that word indirectly, because it means we work through other people. We create value through other people, right? Whereas other disciplines create value more directly. So let me tell you a little bit more about what I'm talking about. So when you look at like an org chart and we pick out a few really common roles, right? So engineers build features for customers, and customers give you money, right? So engineers create value in a very direct way. They build the thing that people pay for and for the business. Marketers, they go and try and find customers for your product and convince them to try it out and to buy it. And those customers give you money, right? So marketers create value in a very direct way. Designers, right? They design something that's going to be really high conversion, right? So when you get people in the door and look at your website, that they're more likely to actually pay for the product, right? So they design experiences that are going to have really high conversion rates, and that increases the rate at which customers give you money. Researchers, on the other hand, are fundamentally different. So what do? We create knowledge about our users, about people, right? And people read your report, right? Like there's a disconnect there. It's different than all the other disciplines where they do actions and customers give you money, versus us, where we create knowledge about users and then we put together a report or some kind of artifact. And that's kind of the end of the story, at least in terms of the work we do. And so the question again is how do we make the people, how do we make the company better, the organization better? Well, it's because of this. So people, read our report, we help them make better choices, right? Which leads to more revenue. So we create more knowledge about our users, and engineers are more effective at creating features that customers will pay us money for. Marketers are more effective at telling the story, so that customers are more likely to want to try out your product. Designers are more effective at designing high conversion experiences, so customers are more likely to give you money. And so this is critical to understand, because when you realize that you are creating value only indirectly, it means that you need to work really hard at developing relationships and trust with the people you work with, right? Because otherwise, if people don't pay attention to what you're doing, you are creating zero value. And that leads to people not promoting you, people not wanting to hire you, people not wanting to work with you. The second thing you need to understand about research and industry at the present is that you have the ability information or produce knowledge, but also disinformation. And that scares your coworkers. So that sounds ridiculous, right? We're not talking about like elections and Twitter bots and all that kind of stuff, which is when we think about disinformation, that's what we probably are thinking about. So I want to unpack this a little bit. And the way to do this is I want to use probably something that you've heard about before. How many of you have heard of the prisoner's dilemma? Do we have a chat here that we can use? Let's see. Can you? Let's see. Where is this? Do you guys have a chat? Where's the chat? Let me see if I can find this. By a show of chat, how many of you have heard of the prisoner's dilemma? Okay, I don't know how to find this. Okay, it's fine. I'll do a quick review. Oh, here it is. More chat. Here we go. Yes, me. Yes, I have. Okay, perfect. So we can do this briefly. So in the prisoner's dilemma, it's a thought experiment, basically. So you have two collaborators who have, let's say, gone and robbed a bank, and they have been caught, or the police have arrested them. And the question is, like, what's going to happen to them, right? And let's say they have them on they definitely have them on a trespassing charge, but they haven't been able to prove yet whether or not they actually robbed the bank. And so they put each of these criminals in two separate interrogation rooms, and each criminal or prospective criminal has a choice. They can choose to stay silent and not cooperate with the police, or they can choose to confess to the crime. So let's go through this experiment and see, like, what happens when each person takes a different choice here. So of course, if they both stay silent, then neither one confesses, they'll both get 1 year in jail because they were caught trespassing, but they're not going to get caught on the charge of robbing the bank, let's say. But what happens when one confesses and one stays silent? Well, the person who confesses, who rats on their collaborator, they get a benefit, right? They get to go free because they get a reward for helping put the other person in jail. And the other person gets a much harsher punishment. The other person gets, let's say, 5 years in prison, right? And if they both confess, then they both get 5 years in prison, right? So it means there's no value in the information each one of them provides. And so, they both get a bad situation. The thing to think about here is when you look at it from the perspective of the two of them combined, right? This criminal enterprise, both the best option is for both of them to stay silent, right? But and the worst option is for both of them to confess. But if you look at it from just one of their points of view, then there's going to be an incentive to probably confess, because you don't know what the other person is doing, right? That lack of quality information, that lack of understanding, and it makes it hard to cooperate and makes it much more likely that you're going to want to confess. So let's try and apply this to the concept of this product manager or researcher partnership. So let's change it up a little bit. Instead of two criminal collaborators, we have a product manager and we have a researcher. And let's create this sort of choice outline as the product manager has a choice between whether or not to embrace the researcher or marginalize the researcher. So embracing the researcher could mean something like helping bring them into the strategy discussions, right? Helping them, giving them the chance to influence, some really important high-level decisions. And the other option is they can marginalize research. Just only give them usability testing tasks. Don't involve them in any of the important decision-making. Just treat them as basically a glorified QA tester. On the researcher side of things, we can have a situation where the researcher is helpful, or we can have a situation where the researcher is unhelpful, intentionally or otherwise, right? So what happens if we sort of play this out? So if the product manager embraces research and the researcher is really helpful, this upcoming product launch, for example, that they may have, right, goes fantastic, right? They involve them in the strategy, defining the strategy. They involve them they were able to go out and do some research that was generative research that was really effective at helping guide the product launch. And so the product launches on time and it goes great. Lots of customers are using it. Now, what happens if the product manager marginalizes research, right? And the researcher is helpful? Well, it's not an optimal situation, right? We have definitely some improvements in usability. The product still launches on time, right? And there's a slightly better experience for the users. What happens if the product manager, though, embraces is unhelpful? Well, there's going to be confusion and chaos on the team as the researcher is asking questions that aren't relevant. They're trying to suggest and do studies that are distracting the team, right? And so all of a sudden, we don't really know what's going on. Engineers start feeling like they're working on the wrong things. There's less clarity in what they're building, all that kind of stuff. And so, obviously this at some point will get sorted out and you still launch the product. It's probably going to get launched later and maybe with a better experience if they start to figure out what's important and whatnot. But it's a non-optimal solution, but it's not the worst, right? But if the product manager marginalizes research, right, and the researcher is unhelpful, right, and they're not even able to help with usability improvements, right, then you're going to launch this product with a poor user experience, and you're probably not going to get great conversions, and it's probably not going to be ideal. So this is all from the company's point of view. What's best for the company, right? And this, as researchers, is often how we look at things, right? How do we help the organization? What's best for the organization, right? But what we fail to do is look at things from the perspective of just the product manager, right? Because when you do that, the outcomes and what are the difference between good and bad outcomes can be quite different, right? So let's think about the product manager for a minute. Their incentives, their bonuses, their promotions are probably going to be very much in line with launching things on time, with making sure that everyone on the team is happy and knows what they're doing, being an effective communicator, all that kind of stuff. So let's look at this same thing just from the perspective of the product manager. And you notice some differences because in 3 of these scenarios, the product launch happens on time, right? And in one of these scenarios, not only does the product not launch on time, but it feels like the product manager is out of control, or they don't have control of the team. They don't have control over their timelines. We don't really know what's happening. The team is confused. We're building things that don't matter, and we're not sure why we're building things. Everyone's working on different stuff. And so from the perspective of the product manager, there are 3 acceptable scenarios here and 1 not acceptable scenario here. And what you'll notice is the 1 not acceptable scenario here falls under the category of them embracing research, right? So the safe bet for the product manager, research, because that will have the least impact on their ability to launch things on time and to get their promotions and to get their incentives. So think about that, right? That's a pretty, from the company's point of view, they should always embrace research because that gives us the best chance at the best outcome. But from their point of view, based on their incentives and their priorities, embracing research is the only risky choice. And this is just like when we're looking at the lens of the researcher being helpful or unhelpful. What if the product manager is thinking about whether or not the researcher is incompetent versus unhelpful, right? Do they even know what they're doing? How would they know that? Or maybe the researcher is malicious. Maybe the researcher wants my job because they see as a product manager, I have lots of authority and influence. Like, these are things that a product manager could think through and say, it's risky to involve this person in the choices that I'm making, and therefore I should always marginalize the researcher. And so fundamentally, when you get hired, right, when you go into a new organization, your job is to convince the product manager, whoever the power is in the organization, that you are not unhelpful, that you are not malicious, that you are not incompetent, and that frankly, you are very much the opposite. Because once you convince them that you are going to be helpful, you're going to help make the product successful, you're going to help them get their promotion, them look amazing in front of their boss, that is when they start to think of embracing research not only as not risky, but as the right thing to do. So the takeaway here is, in today's environment, building trust with people in power, usually a product manager, is actually fundamental to your job success and is part of your job. So if you're in a situation where nobody is giving you the opportunity to work on generative projects, to work on some more higher impact stuff, it's probably a problem with trust. It's probably a problem with the product manager looking at you and saying, involving this person in important decisions is going to be risky for me and my career. And so to fix that, you got to start by building trust, getting coffee with this person, showing them that you know what you're talking about, that you're here to help, that you want to help them succeed, and that you're going to have their back. And so that is kind of like where we're at today with research and practice. It's all the methods and stuff that you've been learning about. It's all of the it's all the analysis techniques that you've learning about. But more than anything, it's understanding that you don't create value directly, requiring you to have other people really embrace you and embrace your work. And the second is that you understand that there are actually incentives for them to not do that, for them to marginalize you. And the way to work around that is by building these relationships, doing it effectively, doing it as quickly as you can, and proving that you are going to be a trustworthy partner for the product's success. But this is not always going to be the case. And so in the future will look quite different. And so the next section, we're going to talk about the fact that the world of research is changing, and it's changing very quickly. And I'm going to tell you what I think it's going to look like. But first, let's take a quick break for questions, if that's okay, and see if there's anything that I can clarify before we go any further. Does anybody have any questions about the last little bit, or did that seem pretty clear? So let's talk about the future of research.
Okay.
And so here I have three big predictions for what's going to happen in the 2020s, right? And so what I want to do is I want to tell you what they are. I want to explain why I think these predictions will come true. And then kind of the implications of this, right? Which hopefully will be mostly self-evident. So I have three. So the first one is that customer behaviors and attitudes are going to force almost all companies to invest very heavily in research teams moving forward. So instead of being a single researcher with 250 other employees, maybe there'll be 10 researchers in 250 employees. So the ratio of researchers to the rest of the company will go up. The second is that democratized research becomes the norm. And the third is that UX research teams change into something different that I call research departments, or some people might call them insights departments. So those are three predictions. Let's talk about why I think these things are going to happen. So again, the first one is that customer behaviors and attitudes are going to force pretty much every company to invest very heavily in research. So let's take a look back, right? And I'm going to focus on tech because tech tends to be the fastest moving thing, and it's where I'm most familiar and where most of my experience has been. But I think this applies to everything. So in the early days of the internet, let's say, right, there was this attitude of build it and they will come, right? And this actually was the right philosophy when it came to building a product. And so this is the first website for a company you may have heard of called eBay, used to be called Auction Web. And this is what it looked like. And this is another one that you might have heard of. This was the first version of PayPal. Also not much to look at. And this was Twitter, which kind of looks a little funny now. So those things all look not particularly inspiring, right? And the other thing that's really interesting about those three companies is that all three of those companies are network effects companies, right? It's not valuable to use eBay if you're the only person on eBay, or there's only 5 people on eBay. Like there's not enough buyers, there's not enough sellers, so there's no value there. Same with Twitter. If nobody's on there, if nobody's tweeting, like what's the point of using it? So all these were network effects businesses that needed a lot of users to be valuable, and yet lots of users came, right? And in the early days, build it and they will come made sense as a mantra because there was not a lot of people on the internet, right? The technology was nascent and limited. People were looking for things to do. People were looking to explore this stuff. And so a philosophy of if I make it, people will show up and use it was what was actually true. And this is how people behaved, right? But today things are changing. And so this is just a chart of total number of websites. And as you can see, it's exploded since the creation of eBay and since the creation of PayPal, for example, right? So PayPal was founded around, I think it was like 2000 or 1999, something like that, right? The number of websites has like 1,000x since then, right? And so there's more and more stuff than there ever has been, right? And the other thing is that the number of people that are actually accessing these sites, accessing these products has changed dramatically too, right? The penetration of internet use is rapidly approaching 100%, right? And so the underlying characteristics of who made up the world's economy, particularly in the web and the internet, have changed dramatically in the last 20 years, right? And we're approaching the point where everyone is online, everyone is buying, everyone is using. And so the thing that you need to take away here is that we are not actually, us as builders, creators, we're not actually representative of our own users anymore. So in the early days of the internet, I called them times of homogeneity, right? If you look at the people that use the internet, they were all people with some kind of means, right? They all had some amount of discretionary income. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to buy a computer. They wouldn't be able to pay for dial-up internet. There are people who, mostly came from Western countries that had a particular value system, in the United States in particular, very individualistic, very focused on self. They were all speaking English for the most part. They all had similar abilities. They all had similar preferences, right? But of course, as the internet and as access to the internet reaches like literally everyone, that is going to change, and it is changing. And so we're now in kind of times of heterogeneity. So people on the internet now have varied socioeconomic means. They have varied values. They have varied languages they use, varied abilities, varied preferences, right? And so in the early days, we were building for people mostly just like me. And today we are building mostly for people not like me, right? Or not like you. And so what do you do? Because your intuition is no longer as valuable as it was in the past. What's the answer? And so the answer is obviously, well, you have to do research, right? So let me give you a few examples of how research has fundamentally shifted the way certain products were built. So by a show of hands, how many, or by typing of the letter Y, how many of you have heard of Facebook Lite? Let's see if I can go back. So a couple people. Yeah, okay. Yes, great. So for those of you that are familiar with it, you know that the reason Facebook Lite was invented was because of the limited quality of the data that people could get in emerging markets, the limited data storage availability on the phone, right? This was from research that Facebook had done to understand the particular life experiences of people that lived very far away from the San Francisco Bay Area. And they said, we need to build a new version of our product that's going to fit their lives, right? And so that's where Facebook Lite came from, and it has been incredibly successful. Another great example of this is in Slack. So Slack obviously was created, and it was, when it was created, it was really designed and built for the English language more than anything, right? And so, lots of people all over the world used it, but they could only really use it in English. And they're trying to expand into and grow the user base of Slack and expand it to new markets. And one of the big ones they wanted to expand to was Japan. And so, of course, Japanese characters and Japanese language is fundamentally very different from English, right? So we think about how we use Slack, we have @ symbols and names and @ here and @ channels, all that stuff. How do you change that and apply that to Japanese language? But even beyond that, Japanese business culture is very different from, let's say, the business culture of Silicon Valley, right? So how do you understand how to modify the way Slack works to make it more acceptable and palatable and helpful in a different culture, right? And so they actually spent a year, the research team there, heavily focused on understanding work in Japan and how to make Slack work in Japan. And they modified the product pretty dramatically in order to make it work. And they had an incredibly successful launch, right? As a result of research that was done, because again, the people in Japan who they wanted to build Slack for were not representative of the people in Silicon Valley. They actually had to go and talk with them and learn about them. And this is one of my personal experiences that was very moving for me, which was when I was working at TWG, we did a project with a company called Accessible Media Inc. And they were building a video player for people with visual impairment. And so believe it or not, lots of folks with visual impairment love watching videos. Some of them can see limited amounts of the screen, some of them can't see at all, and they listen. But video players are great tools for entertainment and for learning, and they wanted to build something there. And so, of course, if we're going to build a video player that's going to be accessible, we had to spend a lot of time learning about people with visual impairment. So we had tons of conversations with people from that community, and it was very informative, and it was a very eye-opening experience for me. And so the key thing to understand here from all of this is that as the world becomes more connected, right, the platforms we use become more diverse. And so investing into research is a competitive advantage. In fact, it's fundamental to a company's ability to actually achieve its goal, right? Because if you don't do that, you're opening up opportunities for competitors to come and take away market share and beat you. And if there's anything that corporate America, corporate Canada knows they want to do, is they want to own an entire market. They want to be like a monopoly company. So they're going to have to invest in research in order to achieve those business goals. So the importance of doing research, the role in the organization, it's going to become more fundamental to the success of the companies that we work at. So let's move on to the second prediction. So democratized research becomes the norm. So quick yes or no in the chat. How many of you have familiarity with this concept of democratization of research? Okay, we got it. 1 yes, 2 yeses. Maybe some of you have heard of it, but don't really know too much about it. Okay, so a few yeses, good. So I think that democratized research is going to become the way that research gets done in companies. So in order to understand why, let's go back in time. So back in the day, in the early days of research, it looked a lot like this. I hope some of you are familiar with the show Silicon Valley. It was very funny. But basically focus groups, lots of people around the room, really focused on usability, really focused on, some kind of high level thoughts. Can people actually make this thing function, right? And so essentially research was a function of quality assurance, of QA, right? We were working with engineered prototypes or products. The focus was on usability and functionality. The goal here was to not get fired by having to recall all your products, because back in those days, if you made a word processor, it wasn't like people just went to a website and used it. or went to a website and downloaded an application. Back in the day, if you made a word processor, you had to create it, put it on a CD or a floppy disk, put it in a box, send it to Walmart and Best Buy in massive quantities. And then people actually had to go drive to Walmart or Best Buy and purchase that box and then take it home, unpack it, put the floppy disk or the CD in their computer and install the application. That's how it used to happen. And so of course it makes sense for research to be focused on things like usability, right? And functionality, because you don't really have the opportunity to ship a product update. What you put in that box is what people are going to get. And if it doesn't work, people are going to be very upset and it's going to be very expensive for you to fix it. But of course that changed. And with the advent of web applications and mobile applications that can be updated all the time, we realized that research focusing on usability was not as high value as we thought it was, right? And so research moved from being a function of like quality assurance to kind of being a function of design, right? Because rather than actually having engineers build something which is costly in time and money, we can actually take prototypes and with the use of tools like Envision and Balsamic and Marvel, we can make them clickable so people can actually interact with them. And so we went from testing actually built things to testing concepts or ideas, right? With a more of a one-on-one focus and with the objective of like, let's really try and make this design make sense, make it work, let's get this idea right so that it works for our users. But that still wasn't enough because even at this stage, right, we're taking for granted the assumptions and assertions from the product managers, other people on the team that have an idea of what they want to see exist, but we don't even know if their underlying assumptions or axioms are true. And so research changed again, and it started to become a function of kind of like product strategy. And so instead of just testing prototypes, we started working on learning about lived experiences of target customers, of users. So focusing on developing context, on understanding problems that people have. So this could be things like interviews without having a prototype or a product to show with anyone, or maybe it's observational, things like ethnographic studies. And the goal became, you know what, it's really important to make sure we build the right thing. Then we can focus on building the thing right and making sure that the prototype works or that the product experience works great, but let's make sure we're focused on the right thing. And so one of the things to understand is that just because we've added new types of work to our arsenal of things that we do, doesn't mean that usability testing is no longer important. Doesn't mean that prototype testing is no longer important. It just means that we have more important things that need to get done. And so what do we do about that? Well, most companies are not going to hire an army of researchers and have some focused on usability tests and some focused on generative stuff. They need to find a different way. And so this is where the democratization of research comes in. And so we can think about all the methods that we use, all the things that we do, and let's put them on a plot here of just like one dimension, which is like, let's just call it complexity. So there are some things that are really complex to do and some things that are very straightforward to do. So if you think about an organization that you work in and you plot these methods, or, you know, for your situation, what stuff is really complex and what stuff is not complex. And maybe you end up with something that looks like this, with usability tests being very straightforward and with like ethnographic research being really complex and difficult to do. And so what we can do is say, you know what, let's try and have our dedicated researchers focus on the really hard stuff, the stuff that only they can do. And maybe we can have them do the rest. Right? Do the stuff that's pretty straightforward. And so we can draw a line somewhere where we say, you know what, on the right, that's too hard for product managers. Left, this is stuff that other people can do with our support. And so this is the essence of the democratization of research. And it's democratization is kind of a misnomer. It's not really about giving everyone an equal say. It's about giving everyone a role. It's about giving everyone a chance to participate in research and supporting people who are who have less expertise in research to do it well in areas where they can do it well. And so what this actually allows us to do is, without hiring 50 more people, to rapidly increase the amount of research that gets done, and also lower the cost of communicating that research. Because if a designer and a product manager are doing their own usability test, we don't need to worry about writing a report that's going to be really effective at communicating the findings, because they were there, they did it themselves, so we don't have to worry about it. So there's huge efficiencies with research democratization, and it also allows us to focus on what we're uniquely well suited to do. So really hard research, like custom hard surveys, international research, ethnographic research, and give away the stuff that's pretty straightforward: automated NPS surveys, prototype tests, usability tests. And one question that you might be asking, which is totally fair, is like, are people on our team who aren't researchers capable of doing this? And so the perspective I'd like to share with you on this is, in essence, we're all some kind of researchers. Like we all practice research on a daily basis. So when you're going out for dinner with friends back in the days before the pandemic, right? You're trying to find a place to go. Well, you're probably going to look up, places on Yelp. You're going to read reviews. You might call to see, like, if they have any specials or deals. You're gathering information about different options, and then you're making a decision based on the research that you've done about what restaurant you might want to go to. Or maybe before you take your next job, right? You might want to talk to some past employees. What's the culture like? What are the managers like? Is it a fun place to work? Is it going to be challenging? Is it going to be interesting? All those conversations and messages that you might send with current or former employees, that is research too, right? And you synthesize that knowledge to make a judgment about whether or not you'd like to work there. Or for our conference, when we pick a venue, right? It's us going to places, checking them out, talking to people, all that kind of stuff. And it's not researchers who are making these judgments. It's people who aren't researchers. And so to some extent, we're all doing research every day. The question is what kind of research it is, and can us as professional researchers better support others in doing this kind of work? So it's okay to feel a little bit weary about giving away some of the research work that you might be doing normally. But it's also okay to hand it off, because we all have some kind of familiar with this gathering of information, synthesizing it into a conclusion, and actioning on it in some way. So the takeaway here is, because the demand for research, remember, research is becoming more important as the world becomes more connected. So the demand for research is increasing, and the amount of research, the types of research we have to do is increasing. So the only way to meet that demand, by definition, is with some kind of democratization. We can't hire 1 million researchers, so we have to find ways to give other people in the company the ability to do good research on their own. So let's come to our third prediction, which is that UX research teams become research departments, or some people might call it insight departments. So let's review what we just talked about as our takeaways. So the first thing is that more people, research is going to be more important than ever because of a more connected and diverse world. And the second thing is more research is going to be done because of research democratization, which leads us to a natural question. How on earth are we going to manage all of this research? Because remember, if a product manager is doing research over here and another designer is doing research over there with the same population, but they don't have the same shared understanding about, how these people find the product, they could end up coming up with the wrong conclusions, or it might just cause confusion because we don't have a shared understanding about what's important, right? About what we learned over here and how that translates to a different part of the company, or about who's doing the same project right now with the same audience, and that we don't want to keep repeating the same work, right? So this is a big problem, or it's going to be. So the answer, I think, is that we need a research department, and it has to be run by a research leader who understands both the business needs, the business model, the economics, and who can also translate those needs into research methods and questions, right? They can operationalize democratization efforts, and who can plan a research roadmap. And so there was a fantastic conversation I had on our podcast, the UXR podcast, our first episode, where I interviewed the Senior Director of Research and Analytics at Slack, Christina Janzer, who is one of the brightest people I've ever talked to about this. And she, at Slack, she runs research and analytics there, and she does all of this work. And what they've figured out at Slack, I think, is going to become the model for how this stuff works. And so let's dig into an important part of this. right? Which is, how does research work come into existence right now, right? And so today what's typical is a product manager or designer will come up with something that they think needs to get done, and they will tap the back of a researcher and say, please do this project, right? And I think this is not an optimal way to do work as a researcher, right? Because as a researcher, we know it's important to make sure we're talking about we're prioritizing the right kind of work. What are the big questions we should be focused on, not just the tactical stuff? And how do we know that the research we're doing with one PM is connecting to the research being done in another part of the organization? And so I want to talk to you about what I think these research flows are going to look like in the future. So first of all, I don't think it makes sense that we start at this individual contributor level and say, hey, we need some research done. What we really need to do is start from the top. The CEO says, here are goals we have for 2021. They pass it off to the executive team, and the executive team needs to come up with plans. So the chief product officer needs to think about, well, what are we going to build to achieve this goal? The marketing team is going to need to figure out, how are we going to market this to hit that goal? The engineering team is going to have to figure out, how are we going to build this to hit that goal? And of course, with that, there's going to come uncertainty and mystery. And we're going to need to figure out the answers to certain questions in order for the executive team to be able to hit those goals. And I think they're going to pass that to a VP of research or some kind of research leader. And that VP of research is going to do one of two things. So on the one side, some of the questions are going to be very difficult to execute on and are going to require research specialists. So let's think back to the Slack example where they wanted to launch in Japan. Doing cultural research is going to be a very hard thing that I would not trust a product manager or designer with. We're going to need a specialist international researcher to help us figure this out. And so they're going to delegate those tasks there and have them come up with a plan for how we do that kind of work. The other option that they have is say, okay, there's also a lot of research that's not going to be particularly difficult, but that still needs to get done. And so they'll have a research operations manager who will be responsible for making sure that people are able to do research on their own and support them in that process. So for example, one of the goals might be, we want to hit a certain score on NPS. And so the research operations manager is going to need to figure out how to operationalize the automatic sending of surveys, when you send them, how you send them, which product managers are able to send them, all that kind of stuff. And they're going to work with teams of product managers and designers to support them to do their own research. But the beautiful thing about this is that this is inherently strategic, right? Instead of us doing tactical work based on whatever a product manager or designer thinks is interesting, we're tying our value into important objectives that the entire company has, that the CEO and the board and the executive team have set out. And that is going to be really helpful for us in our growth as a discipline, because now we're going to be able to achieve our real value, right? Which is helping uncover mysteries, helping produce knowledge so that other people can make better decisions, not just at a product manager level, but at a VP level, at a C-suite level, at a board level. And that's going to be a really exciting development. And don't forget the specialization. There's a specialization happening in research right now. So there's people who are specializing as survey scientists and market researchers, ethnographers. The amount of unique skill sets that are being developed is increasing. And that just means that it's going to be even more important to have an insights or research department led by a research leader who can help translate all this stuff into business goals and vice versa. So the takeaway here is, if the research volume and participation in the team is increasing, a research department is required to plan, coordinate, and lead research. And so this is something that I think is already happening, and I think it will continue to happen over the next decade. And so just to recap what I think those predictions are, so customer behaviors and attitudes are going to force almost all companies to invest heavily in research. Democratized research is going to become the norm, and UX research teams are going to become UX research departments led by research leaders. And those are my predictions for the next decade. And again, big shout out and thank you to Audrey and Clue and the NSERC and all the wonderful folks who have helped make this happen. If you have any questions or you want to connect, I'm on Twitter. That's my email address. And if we don't get to answer your questions here, feel free to reach out to me anytime. And that is all I have for you.